Oh, hey, there we go. And Sam, if at the end of this you say, I really don't like what some of those people said, we won't circulate the recording. But it's really good to have you. I've been a big fan since my baseball card days, and we've been a lot of people signed on early, and we've been talking about you're sort of a cult figure, and it's no surprise we have 42 people who've signed in. Listen to you, and I know you have a big celebration, I think on Saturday in Cleveland.
That's if I can get in there.
Pardon me?
That's if I can get in there. I've been looking at the weather report, and I've already canceled 2 of my flights, United, because of the weather that's supposed to be there, the severe ice storm and then the snowstorm. And so I may not get there.
Well, they'll have to figure out a way to get you in. They need you in Cleveland. I will say this: you've got a great head of hair. Most of us are lacking in that area, but you.
Oh, I'm sure it'll leave me when I get old. I'm only 80. I'm starting to look like Marty.
Yeah, I've lost some of mine already. That's for sure. And I'm only 65.
So,
by the way, earlier, just to clear up something, earlier, the Trzaskowski home run. I need to ask him who was the manager that year, and why did the manager call my pitches, and yet I get blamed for it.
We'll get into that. We know all about Bertie Tebbets, and we'll get into that. There's a number of people who felt that you should just throw fastballs all the time, and you want to become a more complete pitcher. I think your run with the Indians is one of the greatest of that team. I think you're the best, one of the best Indian pitchers of all time. You hold records with them. You have the most strikeout. You're third in history in the most strikeouts per 9 innings and fewest hits in 9 innings, and one of the best pitchers in the history of that franchise. But some people don't know, Sam, that you had 2 professions in your life. You were a baseball player, but you also, after you retired, entered into another longer and very successful profession. And I thought I'd start out, as I mentioned, you got a call from Joe Garagiola in 1993. And can you tell a little bit about that story?
Yes. To give it a little bit of a background, after my baseball career, I was coerced into going back to school once I went through my own recovery, and I became a mental health counselor, never thinking that I'd get back into baseball because of all the bridges I burned. However, the Texas Rangers called me back and hired me, then Toronto Blue Jays and so on. But in referring to the call from Joe Garagiola, they were starting a special program, the commissioner's office, to try and help former ball players. They were running on hard times. And I knew about it, and I had been contacted a couple times to try and help out with designing it and so on. But on this particular day, I got a call from Joe saying it's an emergency. And he explained to me that the ball player was in the middle of trying to commit suicide. And so I asked him for the phone number if he could get that. And I talked to the ball player. Of course, I'm making this as short as I can. I called the ball player and I calmed him down, stabilized him, then got him to agree to special kind of help, including the EMS that were on their way and so on. And eventually the ball player did except what I said, did take the help that I gave him. And to this day, he's doing fine. In fact, he's an ordained minister helping children that are in trouble. And I'm referring to Bernie Carbo, which a lot of people can remember from the World Series and Boston. I'm not saying anything out of confidentiality. That was publicized 3 or 4 times in the public and in Bernie's book that he wrote.
So yeah, Carbo wrote a book, and he basically had the car running with the garage door closed, and came in to have one last drink, and you gave him a call, and you basically kind of, as he describes it, gave him instructions of what exactly he needed to do. And your training as a sports psychologist or a counselor must have come in real handy.
Well, it did. The first thing I had to do, by the way, when I first talked to him, he was still in the car with the motor running. And what I first had to do was I had to stabilize him and help him to see an opening, that the world wasn't going to end and he didn't have to end it, that there was light at the end of the tunnel. And then I had to explain to him how it was going to come about, and then get him to buy into it, which he did. And that's all a part of crisis intervention and helping to prevent suicides. And ultimately, as I said, he did become successful in his own recovery. His particular problem with drug and alcohol abuse, as you know, but the other suicides are not necessarily always drug and alcohol. In fact, the second player that I didn't know if you want me to talk about or not, but 6 months later, I got a call from Joe Garagiola again about a player on the 11th floor of a hotel in Las Vegas. And this had nothing to do with drug and alcohol abuse. He had just been told he had terminal cancer. And I talked to the individual while he was out on the balcony and helped stabilize him, then got him to calm down and to go downstairs, and we got him professional help. And he lived on for 7 more years at peace with his family, with himself, and he died with his family around him from the terminal cancer. But that's only 2 of numerous individuals that were in that position that we helped.
Well, it's a wonderful, wonderful thing you've done, and that second career is something I know that you hold every bit as dear, maybe more so than your baseball career. The Samuel Edward McDowell was born September 21st, 1942 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. You had 4 brothers, a sister, and so tell us a little bit about your upbringing and what that was like.
Well, in my family, all of us were athletic. Excuse me. And we get that from both my mother and father. My dad, as you might remember, he was the quarterback for University of Pittsburgh that went to the Rose Bowl. But he was a star in football, basketball, and baseball. And he taught each one of us kids from the time that we were waddling in our diaper, basically how to enjoy the sport and have fun. And that's basically where it stemmed from. In fact, I have, of my brothers, I had my youngest brother who was too stubborn to learn. He could have been a major league player, but he didn't make it because of his stubbornness. But I had a younger brother who was a superstar at the University of Akron football. And the second year he was playing, he tripped going through the line, fell on his arm and smashed it into about 11 different pieces. And after 3 or 4 operations, he was never able to really continue his football career. My older brother, who was far better than I was as a pitcher, and I don't say that jokingly, he was. He had, in his junior year, he had every scout in baseball coming to see him pitch. The big difference between him and me was he had control. I never had control, either of my fastball or me. But in any event, his senior year, he gets all kind of scholarships in football offers. Baseball, there wasn't too many teams back in those days, but he got 2 scholarships from Michigan and from Arizona. And he gets polio and paralyzes his entire right side. And even to this day, it's still paralyzed on the right side, which is amazing. He's such an athlete. During his younger days, he's 88 now. But during his younger days, he became a 7th handicap at golf, playing one-handed.
Wow.
It was amazing. But in any event, every one of us, we played sports and we never had time to do anything else. I mean, I played football, basketball, baseball, tennis, and cross country. And so every single day I was either practicing or playing. So never had much time for anything else. None of us did.
At 6'5" and very athletic, did you ever consider basketball?
No, I considered football. I really liked football. But back then I only got one offer. And back then it was kind of weird because in my high school and in the amateur football teams I played for, I was both a quarterback and an end. And of course, back then you played both offense and defense. And I was a defensive end. But everybody knew when I was a quarterback and I was going to throw a pass. And everybody knew when I went to the end that a quarterback was going to throw me the pass. But it still worked out well for me and I enjoyed it. Basketball to me was I just love sports.
I want to interject something real quick here. And Sam is unduly modest sometimes. But first of all, I found his childhood when I wrote about it just so fascinating, and his relationship with his parents was very, very interesting because they provided for him everything they needed to. But Sam, there was some emotional issues that Sam had later on in life that of course, and we all do, we all are affected by how we're brought up, and he had, wonderful parents in a lot of ways, but in other ways, he didn't feel as loved as he would have appreciated at that time as a kid. And Sam can correct me if I'm wrong, but there was kind of a dichotomy in the way that he was brought up, and also about his playing career. They're really, and his older brother, he talked about being better than him, and that would be really saying something, because Sam was pretty much scouted and attacked as an athlete by just about by every major league team that there was. There were 16 at that time, and he got a $75,000 scout offer, which was very lucrative when he finally signed with the Indians. And of course, he did announce his signing on national television, not to tell the truth. And that says about everything you need to know about that. But I did find his childhood, and I think readers will find his childhood and high school days and all that whole era of his life absolutely fascinating. I was just fascinated by all of that, and how Sam tied his upbringing together with emotions that he felt later on early in his career.
Yeah, that To Tell the Truth episode you can find on YouTube.
Yes,
And
you can.
The
Just put
amazing,
Sam McDowell To Tell the Truth, right?
The amazing thing about that is they started out with 3 people in shadows, and then they put the lights on them when they all say they're Sam McDowell. And anybody who didn't know who was Sam McDowell, as soon as they showed those three guys, here you had a 6'5" athlete, you know, built like an athlete, and the other two guys looked like actuaries. But they three of them got it wrong. Only Tom Polston
Right.
picked it right.
Yeah. Number one. Well, he had some good answers. Number one had some good answers. Sam
Yeah.
had some good answers, but they chose that number one guy, and he didn't look particularly like a great athlete.
So Sam, you as a high school student went to Catholic high school 2 blocks from Forbes Field, and you would go over there and pitch batting practice to the Pirates, right?
Right.
What was that like?
Well, basically, to me, it wasn't a big deal either way, because as you'll read in my book, I was in this semi-fog most of my years growing up, and it really didn't hit me that much because I didn't follow any sport. I didn't have time to go listen to a game on TV. I never heard a baseball game, never saw a baseball game until I pitched in one my own professionally. And when I went to Forbes Field to pitch batting practice, I really didn't know any of the players. I had heard vaguely, like the name Ralph Kiner or Bob Friend, and once in a while a guy named Elroy Face, but it really didn't register with me. And I just kind of went there and didn't think either way, good, bad, or indifferent. I wasn't able to stay for any of the games because I had to get home to do my homework and all that stuff. And my parents weren't thrilled with me staying anyhow, where I wouldn't have gotten home until 11 or 12 o'clock at night. And I had to get up, of course, at 5:30 or 6 o'clock to go to school. But also football. I never saw a football game either in my life until after I became a professional baseball player.
So is it true that the first game you ever saw, major league ball game, it was you were on the mound as a starter?
Yes.
And we'll get to that, but you didn't do too badly in that game.
No, I was doing fairly good until I broke 2 ribs.
Broke 2 ribs throwing the ball.
Yep, just throwing the fastball. It was a very cold evening, as most of you know, in Cleveland in the summertime, in late September. It got cold coming off that lake. And it was a very cold night, and I tried to throw a fastball 3-2 right by Jim Lemon, and I heard pop, pop, and that was it. I couldn't breathe anymore.
So as Marty said, in high school, you dominated. Your senior year, you threw 63 innings and struck out 153 batters, I think, meaning looking at it the reverse way, only 37 batters made outs without striking out. They didn't, and I'm guessing about half of those bunted the ball. You were dominant that year.
Yeah, I would say that I had some pretty good success and fun and enjoyed it. And by the way, some of those players that I used to pitch against in high school, some of their names, Richie, Joe Namath, Mike Ditka. These were some of the guys I faced.
You may have chased them into another sport. And good for them.
I remember Joe Namath in his book, he was talking about when he was in high school that they were getting on a bus, were going to come down and play Central Catholic. And they were all talking about this guy, Sam McDowell, that he apparently didn't know what he was doing on the mound. And Joe Namath was asking questions about it because he knew he was going to have to face me. But he says when he got off the bus, he heard this pop, pop, pop. It was me warming up on the sidelines with a cigarette in my mouth. And he said there was no way he wanted to play.
yeah, I mean, if you didn't have great control, that would be another intimidator. So then you got, as Marty said, there were major league teams all around, and you signed with the Indians. They paid a bonus of $75,000, but your parents wanted you to start in the low minors.
Correct. My dad made a rule that whatever team was going to sign me, once I was signed, he wanted me to start at the bottom and earn my way all the way up to the top. He didn't want me given any special treatment because he thought it was very important that longer on in my career that I would appreciate it because it would make me better and stronger. And obviously I'd have more experience. And I agree. I agree. Although Gabe Paul didn't agree because he brought me up after just 1.5 years.
Yeah, he was in class, I think he started out in class D and then went right to AAA. And then before you know it, he was pitching his first major league game and shutting out the Twins in September of '61.
Yeah,
Before
and
my birthday, I was still 18.
Yeah, 18 years old against the Twins. And isn't that where you got the nickname Sudden Sam?
Well, in my mind, that's where I got it, I believe. It was Harmon Killebrew. However, there's a writer in Cleveland, Dolan, who claims that he gave it to me. And to be quite frank with you, I really can't argue either way, because I remember emphatically that reporters went up to Harmon Killebrew and Jim Lemon after that initial game that I pitched against them and asked what they thought about that young teenager out on the mound. And I remember one of the reporters came back and told me that Killebrew said, well, his fastball gets up there all of a sudden. And then from that point on, it was Sudden Sam. But as I say, I really don't know exactly where it came from. And to me, it wasn't that important.
Well, I like that story better, so we're gonna
Okay, let's go with that.
We're gonna print the legend. So you're in the minors now, and you're striking out batters just like you always have, and also high on the walk count. And
you didn't have to bring that up.
It's it's out there in the internet, unfortunately, but that's what happens with pitchers who throw hard. But Mel Harder at some point in time looked at your mechanics and your windup and everything, and he said nobody touch him. Is that right?
Yeah, he said he's got 4 of the greatest pitches I've ever seen. He said he doesn't need any help. All he needs to do is pitch, get experience. And so he sent that order down to Lakeland, Florida, down to Charlie Gassaway, who was my manager at the time. And he was a former pitcher. And Mel Harder gave him instructions, just let me pitch.
And who in the minors do you look back on and believe was the most influential in sort of getting you ready for Major League Baseball?
Well, Ted, to be quite frank with you, this is a little bit convoluted. And when I say convoluted, remember that I continually was sent back to the minor leagues up until the middle of 1964. I would come up to the big leagues. I'd do exceptionally well in the minor leagues, be called up to the big leagues, and then the managers would start to call my pitches. And that started from the very beginning. And I'd get my butt kicked, and they'd turn around and send me back to the minor leagues and say, you know, you need more experience to learn how to pitch. And I'd go back to the minor leagues, and I'd kick ass back in the minor leagues, and they'd bring me back up, and the managers would call my pitches again. Now, in the minor leagues, they never called my pitches. None of the managers wanted to take that chance because they didn't want to get fired. But in 1964, it was a combination of all the above, a combination of everything before that occurred. And I finally got upset enough where I took the reins myself, you might say, in that during spring training in 1964. I was pitching against the Giants in Phoenix, and there was a horrendous windstorm, 60 and 70 mile an hour blowing in from center field. And I threw a pitch to Orlando Cepeda, and he turned that wind around. That ball's still going. But in any event, they took me in after the game and said, Sam, apparently it's not helping. You're going back to the minor leagues and start the season out then. Well, that's when I told Bertie Tebbetts and Gabe Paul, I said, don't bring me up. Leave me in the minor leagues. I said, because I'm learning nothing up here. I've gone to Bertie 3 or 4 times, asked him why he's calling pitches. Why can't he help me out to learn why? And he would always give me a sarcastic remark, don't worry about it, kid, I'll make you a star. And so I told them not to bring me up, and they sent me back to minor leagues. That was it. As you know from reading my stats, I was 8-0 with a 0.69 earned run average, and I was 7-0 at the time. And Gabe Paul calls me in Salt Lake City, and he says, "Sam, we want you in Los Angeles tomorrow. You're going to pitch against the Angels." And I said, "Is Bertie Tebbetts going to call my pitches?" And Gabe says, "Don't act like that, Sam. We're doing you a favor. We're going to bring you up to the big leagues." I said, "No, thank you. If he's going to call my pitches, I don't want to come up." And that's when Gabe said, "Well, I'll bury you in the minor leagues." And so he hung up, and I went on to Hawaii and won another game in Hawaii. And the next day we fly into San Diego, and he calls me up and says, "Sam, have it your way." He says, "I want you on the the all-nighter in Washington, D.C. You're pitching against the Senators tomorrow." And I said, "Is Bertie going to call my pitches?" He said, "No. You have it your way. You have my word." And it wasn't I was trying to be a big shot or anything, but I was at the point in my career where I decided either do it or get off the pot. Either I succeed or I fail. I mean, let's go. Let's find out. Let's lay the cards on the table and see where they go. This way, at least I would know if I failed, that I failed because I didn't have it. But with everybody else calling my pitches and telling me what to do, and then I'm getting blamed for it, sent to the minor league, that didn't sit well with me. And so that worked out well. By the way, I also knew the rules, and I knew if they left me in the minor leagues that year, they would lose me. And so that's why I was headstrong and said, "Leave me in the minor leagues."
The difference between Sam McDowell's numbers in 62 and 63, and then 1964 when he came back from the minor leagues is just incredibly. It's just incredible how much he blossomed when he was able to call his own pitches coming back in 1964, and then of course in 1965 when he would have won the Cy Young Award if there was one in the American League, but it was Koufax won it for the major leagues in 65. You know what he was able to do once he got that freedom in 64, and I found that whole era of his life and his clashes with Bertie Tebbetts and Gabe Paul, I found that really, really interesting too. But what he was able to do once he came back from the minors in 64 was remarkable, considering his numbers, previous to that in the major leagues.
Well, one thing I was very proud of in 65, irrespective of getting the Cy Young, as you know, which is given out by sports writers, but I got the pitcher of the year through the Sporting News, which was my own peers. That's the ball players that voted for that, which was a major difference, and I appreciated it. Don't misunderstand me. I would have loved to have had Cy Young, but I know that when you get a special award from your enemy, from the fellow players you're facing, to me, I respected that.
I thought the story about you standing up to Gabe Paul and Bertie Tebbetts at your age without really a track record, and before players had agents and all the protections they have today, that's pretty gutsy.
Well, I figured, what do I got to lose?
Well,
You
they
were only
kinda-
21. Yeah, he's only 21.
so then you come up to the majors and you start out right away and you have a run through I think it's like at least 70, maybe 71, where you're generally running an ERA, having an ERA right around 2, and couple times below 2. Unfortunately, the Indians didn't have great hitting compared to they're kind of middle of the road hitting compared to some of the teams like the Twins, Orioles, and Tigers. But you're in there dealing.
Yep, they didn't exactly hit that well.
68, which was the year of the pitcher, which I think you had a lot to do with that name, was one of your best statistical years. You won 20 games a couple of years later, but 68 is just an amazing year. You didn't get any support. I think you were 15 and 14, but talk about that year.
To me, that was the second best year for me ever in my entire career. When I say second best, I pitched a lot better in 68 than I did in 64. But because of what all transpired in 1964, to me, that will always stick out in my mind as one of the best years because I actually became a player. I actually became a major league ball player and earned it. In 68, I think I led the league in just about everything except wins. And considering that I had a 181 earned run average, usually that would lead all leagues in a 181, but I had another guy on a team by the name of Louis Tion. And Louis Tion won the earned run average award that year with his, I believe it was 118 or 112.
It was no, Gibson had the 112 and Tion had a 1.60. And Tion did not win the Cy Young. Denny McLain won it because he won 31 games. But actually, Tion and Sam both really outpitched Denny McLain that year.
Denny,
I'm going to talk for a second about another YouTube. You and Hawk Harrelson did Who's on First, and I watched that thing. It's every bit as good as Abbott Costello. Did you was Hawk a friend?
He was a very close friend. In fact, he was a roommate one year, but he was a very close friend, and he played that tape in Chicago because he was the announcer there and color man for like 30 years. But every time they had a rain delay or a rain out, you could bet he was going to throw that tape in and people were going to watch that tape. I would get phone calls and emails and letters from people in Chicago that I didn't even know knew me.
It's well done. Both of you do a great job. You know, you're the one you play the role, the one who is like, what is going on here? And Hawk has all the answers, but you all just knock it out of the park.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
I think it is a couple of years later, a ball player who a lot of Indian fans are very aware of, but most others don't know of because his career ended so quickly and early, and that's Tony Horton. And in a book written by Terry Pluto, The Curse of Rocky Colavito, your manager, Alvin Dark, asks you to go and talk to him when nobody else can. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, actually, that was on a particular day that I was pitching. And on days that I was pitching, I wouldn't talk to anybody. I wouldn't talk to the press. I wouldn't talk to very many of my own teammates that much. To me, I was too focused on everything that I had to think about that day, the hitters' strengths and weaknesses and where they hit the ball and what I was going to do and so on and so forth. So it was common knowledge in baseball not to bother Sam McDowell before he was pitching. And in this particular day, Alvin Dark came to me and said that Tony wanted to talk to me. And would it be okay if I made the exception and sit with Tony? And I said, fine, no problem. So we actually started out by going down. I was in my, we call underwear. It's the underclothing before you put your uniform pants and shirt on. And we went down to the dugout and sat there for about a half an hour and talked and what have you. And then I had to get ready for the game. So we went back up to the clubhouse and I got dressed and finished talking with Tony. And then Alvin Dark came and got him and took him into his office. And then a few minutes later, I went out and warmed up. And I don't know what transpired in Alvin's office, but I had no problem with talking to Tony. And I probably was the only one.
It was Sam pitched the second game of that doubleheader, and Tony left before that game. He just bolted the team and actually tried to do himself in that evening, and never played again. That was it. They flew him to California, and he lived with his dad and never pitched again. And it was an extremely sad story. And I remember Sam telling me about that, and we have it in the book. And Sam was talking about how, he found it a little bit ironic that he was trying to counsel Tony Horton about these horrible emotional issues that he had. And Sam felt like, himself, that he had emotional issues of his own. And he kind of found it ironic that he was trying to help Tony when Sam didn't completely have his own life together at that time. And I found that to be, very, very interesting little piece to that book that Sam told me about.
Yeah, I did a little looking, and Tony Horton finally, I think, has gotten sort of on his feet. He's still with us, but he will not talk to anybody about baseball. He just says that's all in the past, and he just evidently just was burnt out from the stress of the game, and I'm sure there's a lot. So in 1971, Sam, you started, you held out, and then you had some, I think, arm injuries, and Alvin Dark got fired, and that's when things started going south.
Yeah, well, actually, because of my alcoholism, it actually started earlier than that, going south off and on throughout my entire career, just progressively getting worse and worse and worse. But when Gabe Paul traded me to San Francisco, to me, I felt devastated because I felt I was a part of Cleveland. I felt that I had so many friends and family members and everybody in the Cleveland area. To me, it was like family. And then he goes ahead and trades me. And that probably hurt me more than anything. And of course, then compounded with my alcoholism, and it was straight downhill from there. I had torn my rotator cuff, didn't know at the time what it was, and they didn't know what it was at that time. I only know that because after baseball, I had some other problems, and they did MRIs on my shoulder, and they saw all the scars that were in there from tearing my shoulder up. But in any event, I had a torn rotator cuff and a tendon problem. And if you notice during the season, there were different periods all during the 71 season where I couldn't make a start. They'd delay my start by 2 or 3 starts, which would be like 2 weeks, just to try and give my shoulder some rest. I took 25 cortisone shots that year.
Ooh.
25 cortisone shots. And in the middle of the year on, it now was cortisone with lidocaine so that I couldn't feel any pain. And I'd go out there and pitch with that. But I was off and on the whole year because of the arm injuries. Now, when I went to San Francisco, they never healed up. In fact, I can remember specifically, I'm in spring training with the Giants up in Casa Grande where they first get started. And I was pitching batting practice like my 3rd or 4th time there. And I came off and I packed my arm in ice and it was black and blue. And Charlie Fox, who was a manager, he comes in and he looks at my shoulder and he says, "What the hell did you do?" And I said, "Charlie, I hurt my arm last year a couple times." And I said, "I thought for certain that Gay Paul told you." They said, "No, nobody told me." And I said, "My arm is sore." And I said, "I just need to rest it." And so I didn't throw batting practice again at spring training for about a week. Then I went back and started pitching. And it seems as though if I could get the extra 4, if I would start every 6 or 7 days, I'd be okay for 7 innings or 6 innings before it really was hurting. But they didn't trade for me, give away their super starter and Gaylord Perry just to have me to be a spot starter. And so they would periodically try and get me back into rotation, and it just didn't work.
So when did the drinking start and how did that progress?
Well, actually, being obsessive compulsive as part of an alcoholic is my whole life was like that, but I didn't drink. I was obsessive compulsive about vitamins and minerals, and I made certain all during my high school I took vitamins and minerals, and in the minor leagues that's what I did. Made certain I was taking different types of vitamins. I even went so far as in the wintertime to go to a doctor, have a blood test to see if I was missing anything that I needed in there or what have you. It wasn't until my 3rd year in the major leagues then I actually took my first drink, which was a rarity there because everybody drank. Everybody had a couple beers back in those days, and I didn't. It was part of also getting attention too, but I pitched well in Chicago in a game, and Barry Latman and Gary Bell asked me out to dinner. Now, in those days, to me, that was really something because back in the day, nobody talked to you. You were ostracized until you earned your way in the big leagues. So for the first 2.5 years I was brought up, nobody talked to me, nobody befriended me, nobody said anything. And it's kind of devastating, especially to a young kid, 19 years old, 18, 19, 20 years old. In any event, I went to Jim Diamond's. I can remember to this day. We went to Jim Diamond's, a famous steakhouse in Chicago. And I sat down and had a T-bone, which they also had. But I remember Gary Bell ordered a Scotch drink and Barry Latman ordered a pink drink. I don't know what it was. To this day, I still don't know. But I know that I ordered one of each. And I had one of each, and then another one of each, and then another one of each. Well, after dinner was over with, Barry and Gary, they walked back to the hotel and went to bed. Not me. I went up and down Rush Street there, and I was in every bar that was in Rush Street on my way home and got severely drunk. Fortunately, found my hotel room. But that's how I started out.
You described yourself as a functional alcoholic. You couldn't have had those great years if you weren't. So how did you manage that?
Well, actually, I did have those years. Well, when I say functional, being a starting pitcher where you're going to pitch every 4th or 5th day, what I would do is the day that I pitched, that night, irrespective of whether I won or lost, I'd go out and drink and get drunk. The next day, I'd come to the ballpark and get in the whirlpool early, thinking if I sweat it out, I'd be okay. Go do extra running and extra calisthenics and so on. And then after the game, I'd go out and get drunk again. Then for the next 2 days and 2 nights, I would not drink. That's when I would make sure I'd take all my vitamins and minerals and fruit juices and all that stuff, thinking that because I didn't drink, that it had no effect on me, which I learned later on, much later on, it did have an effect on me, both emotionally and psychologically. But back then, we didn't know.
And then, so you got traded to the Giants and then sold to the Yankees and then signed with the Pirates. And you were not in a regular rotation eventually. So that routine got thrown off, right?
Well, the routine with the Yankees got severely thrown off my last year with them in '74 because I was getting drunk too often. And so they put me in a bullpen as a long relief man for whatever reason. But in any event, now I couldn't schedule my drunks. And so now nobody knew when I'd show up at the ballpark drunk, you know, and I was a binge drinker where I would go periods of time without ever drinking. In fact, one time I didn't drink the entire baseball season for Alvin Dark. I didn't have one drink the entire season, but when the season's over, I started back up. But there was periods of time where I just simply wouldn't drink over and over and over. Well, now with the Yankees, my last year at '74, I couldn't plan that because now I never knew when I was going to go out drinking and get drunk.
So then you had kind of a last run with the Pirates and were pretty much kind of blacklisted from baseball. And what was the crisis point for you that made you seek help?
Well, I had a couple of years after my getting thrown out of baseball, because that's what happened with Pittsburgh. They had a deal with me when I talked to them in the wintertime because I lived there. They would take me to spring training. If I made the team, they would sign me until I took my first drink. When I took my first drink, that was it. That threw me out of baseball. Well, it went good for about a half a year. Then I pitched a fantastic game against the New York Mets in New York. I, in fact, won the game. I came in the first inning and relieved Bruce Keeson and pitched a shutout from that point on. And afterwards went out and got severely drunk, somewhat so next morning I showed up at the ballpark drunk. And I knew that was it. And that was it. Even though when he did release me, my old friend and roommate, Dick Hauser, was the manager of Kansas City. And he called me up 2 days after my release and said, Sam, I'd like to sign you up with Kansas City here. Would you be willing to come? And I said, no, I had enough. I had enough. Although I didn't know what I was saying, but I had enough of this drunkenness and all that stuff. And it wasn't until a couple of years after that where I lost my family, lost my wife, my kids, on the verge of losing my job, selling insurance. The only thing that kept me selling insurance was I was the best salesman that they had, so they couldn't fire me. I set all kind of records in sales. And I was now living at my house in my mother's house. Sold my house and everything. And one night about 3 o'clock in the morning, stone sober, I came downstairs in my underwear, made a pot of coffee, and I just continued to walk around the living room saying, you beat me, you beat me. I had no idea what I was saying. I had no idea what I was talking about. But later on, I was referencing that the booze beat me and I was willing to surrender. And I thought that I had a mental illness. I never envisioned it could possibly be alcoholism. And so when I went to the rehab to get help, and they showed me it wasn't a mental illness, that it was a disease. In fact, my whole family, I come from a family in which I've got alcoholism throughout my entire family. Mother, father, I got brothers, I got uncles, aunts, and so on. In any event, I found out it was genetic. I found out it was a disease. And once I found out it was a disease, that blew my mind. I mean, it was like the whole world opened up to me because I swear I was mentally ill. In fact, during my baseball career, which you'll read in the book, there was many times that I went to a psychologist during my baseball career, thinking that there was something wrong. And in fact, I would take different coursework in psychology, Psych 1, Psych 2, abnormal psych, and so on. And then sports psychology, which back then was theoretical. It wasn't applied. But in any event, I thought that we could figure it out. And I never did figure it out. Doing all the coursework, talking to all the psychologists and so on, nobody ever thought it was alcoholism back then. And of course, I wasn't exactly honest with them either about how much I was drinking. Well, in any event, once I came out of the rehab, one of my mentors, who was an ordained rabbi who was a psychiatrist, and in fact, it was his rehab that I went to, and he was my mentor for many years after that. And he kept trying to get me to go back to baseball, but I couldn't take the chance.
There was an interesting story about Sam in 1980 when he hit rock bottom and he did seek help and went to the rehab center when he got strong again and he had stopped drinking for a while. He did give some thought to going back to Major League Baseball because he was still in his 30s, mid 30s, late 30s. And he had pitched in some kind of exhibition of some sort. And there was a scout there who told Sam, hey, how would you like to come back into Major League Baseball? And Sam did give it some thought, but he thought that the lifestyle of a Major League Baseball player, again, having that lifestyle might tempt him in a wrong direction. He wasn't quite ready to go that direction. So he didn't follow that, but I found that to be kind of interesting.
Yeah, Marty, I mean,
it happened with the Jacksonville Suns. I was called back for an old timers game there.
That's what it was, yeah.
While I was warming up on the sidelines, I wanted to see what kind of condition I was in. So I kept throwing harder and harder and harder. As you know, in old timers games, you just lob the ball in there and it's all for the hitters. But I wanted to see how hard I could throw and how I could feel about it. And it felt pretty good. And I was throwing pretty hard. And that's when the scout came down from the stands and said he had me on radar. And I was still throwing 97, 98 at the time. And I wasn't even in condition. And so immediately I started thinking it might be possible to go back. But then I decided against it.
yeah, I saw something where somebody measured you at 108 miles an hour at one point in time. Have you?
I don't think 109. The most was 103.
That's pretty good.
And by the way, that was in the ninth inning of the last start that I had with the Yankees in Boston's Fenway Park. That's when it was a Monday night game of the week. And that's when they were now testing lasers, where they had the radar, but they were testing lasers too to see which one was more accurate. And after the game, that's when Whitey Ford came down and told me, because he did the color in the booth that day. He came down and told me, he said, did you know that those guys had you at 103 miles an hour? And at that time, I really didn't care.
In the book, The Curse of Rocky Colavito, practically every one of your teammates and people who knew you said you were a great guy. Give somebody the shirt off his back. Unlike how you were treated, you treated rookies really well. But when you were intoxicated, it was a different story.
Oh yeah, you don't want to be around me. The minute I took that first drink, you better haul ass. In fact, Sparky Lyle in his book, what's it called?
Bronx Zoo?
Oh, the Bronx Zoo, yeah. In his book, he said that Sam's the greatest guy you ever want to meet, but the minute he takes his first drink, get the hell out of there, because all he wants to do is fight.
So then you went through rehab, and somebody convinced you, you ought to be a counselor, and you went to school at University of Pittsburgh and got your degree in counseling.
Well, I didn't, back then they didn't have such a degree in one college. Back then they were still teaching that it was a disease, or it was a psychological problem. It wasn't committed to be a disease until a couple of years later. But the mentor, Dr. Abraham Tversky, that I told you about, he's the one that had me go take this course or go take that course or go take a correspondence course. In fact, he really confused me because the very first course he wanted me to take was the psychological model of addiction from Harvard Medical School, continuing education, which I took, understanding that just a year and a half earlier, I'm in a rehab where they're teaching me it's a disease. Now he wants me to go learn about the psychological model. When I questioned him about it, and that's when he said he wanted me to see both sides of the coin. And in fact, he ended up having me go take different courses for the different models, whether it's aversion therapy, whether it's pharmacological therapy, psych therapy, whatever. He wanted me to know all the different models so that I would be well versed if I ever decided to go into counseling. And then in 1981, I went to Cleveland, Ohio, and Youngstown and Columbus with Dr. Tversky. And I found out about a special program called Employee Assistance Programming. And to me, that sounded very interesting. So I had signed up for that in a correspondence course. And all it really was about 40 pages in a booklet. And then you took a test after that. And with all my background, that's when Dr. Tversky told me, he says, you might as well just go get your certification for counseling now. He says, you got all the credits that you need. And so that's how it came about.
There's going to be, just so you know, folks, there's going to be a revelation in the book. Sam took his first drink with Gary Bell and Barry Latman in 1963 in Chicago. And that same year, things started to come apart for Sam in not only on the mound, but in his personal life. And there's going to be a revelation in the book about 1963 with Sam during the off season that's going to really blow people away. We don't want to reveal it here, but because we want people to read the book, but it's mind-boggling. And one other thing real quick, Ron Blomberg, who was the first designated hitter in baseball history for the Yankees in 1973, wrote a book recently about his relationship with Thurman Munson. And in that book, he talks about walking the streets of New York, coming back from a bar one night, and he saw, and with Thurman, and he saw Sam down on the street, so drunk that he couldn't even pick himself up, and it was pouring rain. And it was, you know, and Sam talked about that in the book, and it's heart-wrenching. It really is, you know, how bad it got for Sam around 74. And they had to kind of carry him back into his room, into his hotel room. But it was amazing that Sam got himself together in 1980 and went to went to the rehab center and did not take another drink thereafter. And most people who are severe alcoholics, you know, go back and they tip back and forth and they take another drink and they have to go back to rehab. Sam had the toughness to go to rehab and stick with it and never take another drink. To this day, it's 42 years later. And I found that to be kind of inspiring.
That's pretty cool. And also inspiring is the fact that he took all that pain and that disease he had, and he's turned it into something that's been a real asset for not just Major League Baseball, but the NFL. I think he's gotten calls from other sports, and, you know, he's got credibility. And it's, you know, Sam, what you've done with your life that's Hall of Fame material.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you.
So we've kept you some time, but I do want to give people time to ask you questions. We have a lot of guests who've been standing by. The first one, if he's still with us, Peter Cottrell, if I pronounce that right, Pete. I know you had a question, an observation you wanted to give relating to Frank Howard.
Pat, thanks. Yeah, we had Frank Howard. We talked to him on Saturday at our SABR chapter meeting. And yeah, I'm a Senators fan from way back. And I remember listening to ball game on the radio in 1970, and I see that there were two of them where you were pitching to him, and then you were moved to a position, and Dean Chance was brought in to pitch to Frank Howard for those two occasions. I was wondering if you could talk to us some about that experience.
Yeah, Frank, I don't know if he mentioned it or not, but Frank and I are very close friends nowadays. But back in the day, he owned me. And in spring training, Alvin Dark came to me and said, Sam, I know that Frank Howard owns you. And he said, I'm just going to tell you now that during the season, if you're pitching against Washington and you're winning the game and we're less than 4 runs ahead, in the 7th inning or 8th or 9th, I'm going to take you out and bring Dean in to pitch against Frank, but I'll put you in right field. And I said, fine, no problem. I said, that probably is saving my life because as hard as he swung and as hard as I threw, he could kill me on that mound the way he was hitting me. And so it came to the 7th inning and we were winning, as you know, 2-1. And he brought in Dean Chance to pitch to Frank, put me at second base because Larry Brown was the last hitter of the inning before. And so that the substitute that he would be putting in would be the first hitter of the next inning. So he put me at second base. And what's interesting about that, I don't know if you know it or not, but I set a record that day. I was the first second baseman left-handed with a fielding average of 1,000. And the reason for that was that there was a guy on first base and Frank hit a one-hopper to shortstop. And Alvin out on the mound said, now there's 2 outs. Instead of flipping the ball to second, because look who's playing there. He said, make the 3rd out at first base. Without thinking, our shortstop at the time, Vern Fuller, catches the one-hopper and flips it without even thinking to second. And I was there. So 1,000 fielding average. But yes, Frank Howard owned me. I threw every pitch known to man, including a spitter. And he hit everything I threw.
That game was on television, by the way. That was a TV game. Back then, only the weekend games were televised on Channel 8 in Cleveland, but I think it was a Saturday or Sunday game because I remember watching it. And I remember Sam taking that throw and kind of clumsily, but he did it fine, took the throw and stepped on second base.
It wasn't clumsily, it was smoothly.
Well, he looked kind of funny doing it because he was 6'5" and he was a pitcher and he was left-handed too. And so it looked kind of odd, but he pulled it off.
Good thing we didn't have to make a double play there. That's hard to twist.
Another thing Hondo said Saturday was he named 4 pitchers in his era who were a cut above all the others: Koufax, Carlton, Frank Tanana before he was injured, and Sam McDowell.
That's
That was
interesting.
nice to hear.
By the way, at JFK, there's 3 seats in dead center field in the upper deck, and all 3 of them are Frank Howard's mammoth hits. One of them is mine.
Oh, didn't know that.
Ryan, I'm going to take a second and see if any of the Cleveland fans have any questions before I get to you. Anybody else?
Craig Lang has a question.
Go ahead.
But he's still.
This is just a quick story about Frank Howard. My dad was a sports writer, Jack Lang, and one time he criticized Frank when he was with the Mets, and Frank wanted to punch him, and a whole bunch of ball players in the clubhouse kept him from doing that. And then the next day, we were going to Philadelphia, and we were driving to Shea Stadium where we get on a bus.
And Mackenzie, it's Jim Nuff, just working on your taxes. Got a couple questions. If you can call me back, that'd be great. 440-260-2000. Thank you.
You can do my taxes.
Yeah,
I thought I was on mute. I'm sorry.
I forgot to file.
we'll all be calling you.
By the way, are you sure that wasn't Frank Thomas?
Oh, it was
Oh,
Frank
my.
Howard, and he broke his car broke down on the way into Shea Stadium. We picked him up and we were driving a Volkswagen. Imagine having him in the car with my father, who had been arguing with him the day before, and myself. I think I was about 12 or 13. I don't even remember.
Where did he stick his legs out the window?
I had to ride with the engine.
And by the way, I remember your dad.
That's neat. So anybody got a question, hit click on the hand, the raised hand. Sam, who were some of your best friends during your career?
Well, I'd have to say Jose Askew, Max Elvis. Max Elvis was the longest roommate I ever had. He was my roommate for like 5-6 years. But I would have to say he's my best friend. But Duke Sims, just Bobby Mercer was until he passed away because of that tumor. But because I did stay in baseball in my second career, I became friends with, I'm going to say probably, not boastfully, but real good friends with maybe 20, 30 former players, which I'm very proud of, because I can remember one time I was told that if when you leave baseball, you can leave with one friend, you're doing something special. And I remember that to this day. And in fact, the guy that told me that was a guy that I really admired. And that's a guy that when I first came up to the big leagues, when I was only 18, he kind of took me under his wing. Very few people know the name, Chuck Asigian.
Yeah, catcher.
Chuck Asigian.
Is Chuck still with us, or you?
Yeah, he became an attorney, a very big and successful attorney in California.
That's great.
He was an outfielder, wasn't he?
He was an outfielder.
You got thrown out of a game one time when you wouldn't give the umpire the baseball. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah, I was just misunderstood. We were playing in Baltimore, and the umpire behind the plate, I forget his name at the moment with my memory. Maybe you could remember, Marty, but anyhow, he
It's
was
in the
having,
book.
what?
It's in the book. I remember. I don't remember the umpire either, but I remember looking that game up and looking up the umpire's name, and it's in there.
Anyhow, he was having a horrendous day. And it was one of the first years he was umpiring. And all during the game, I mean, we were arguing back and forth. And we used to call them homies.
Invite me to that Zoom meeting. With Sam McDowell.
James, you're off mute again.
James, you're still not muted.
Anyhow, we were arguing the whole game, and it got to a point with Chico Simone, which used to be on our team. We traded him to Baltimore, and I threw a slider on 3-2 right down the middle of the plate. It fooled Chico and the umpire, and he called it a ball. And I went berserk. And I came charging into home plate, and Duke Sims was the catcher, and he tackled me. And the umpire, when he come out, he said, "You're out of the game," and blah, 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 and all that. Alvin Dart comes out on the mound and all this shit. And then, lo and behold, he comes back out from home plate to the mound when he's already thrown me out. And he says to me, "Give me the ball, punk." And I said, "Here, go get it." And I turned and I threw it out of Municipal Stadium there in Baltimore. And the next day I get a telegram from the commissioner that I threw a ball 235 feet into the stands, therefore I owe a fine of $235. And I sent him back a check for $250, and I said, "As usual, your umpires are wrong." So he thanked me for the charity.
It was he threw it. It was 3 rows from getting out of Memorial Stadium. I think it was what, 3 rows up, right? 3 rows from the end.
Yep. And in fact, the next day, all the Baltimore players were out there early for batting practice, and they were all trying to throw the ball, and they couldn't. Some couldn't even get them up in the second deck. And yet I was through mine on the third deck. And then some of them were using the fungo, trying to hit it out of the stadium. And Earl Weaver comes screaming out of the dugout and says, the next person that tries a McDowell, you're fined $50. And back in that day, $50 was a lot of money.
Larry Barnett was the umpire.
Larry Barnett, there you go.
Yeah.
Ryan, go ahead. You got a question?
Yeah, I was wondering what it was like to. I was wondering what it was like to play for the Yankees and play with Thurman Munson and play for George Steinbrenner.
Well, Thurman Munson probably was one of the smartest catchers that I've ever thrown to. He was a very good guy, a very class act, a real gentleman, but he was a tiger when he put that uniform on. And when you want to talk about a guy that's got determination, a guy that's got really and truly that inner fire, you're talking about Thurman Munson. But I was fortunate to play with a lot of good catchers. Another one was Ray Fosse. Ray Fosse, to me, had as much talent as any catcher in the history of baseball, including Johnny Bench. And after that collision, that's where the major problem was. He broke his collarbone during that All-Star game, but didn't know it for half a year. And then lo and behold, halfway through the season, they find out that he broke his collarbone and it healed, one bone on top of the other. And back in those days, they couldn't go back in an operation and re-break it and heal it back up normally or the right way. So the rest of his career, every time he tried to open up with his swing, it was painful. And so it cost him his major league career. As you know, 2 years later, he's traded to Oakland and ultimately became their color man on television. He was a real class act, a real guy. I loved the guy. He was a good guy. In fact, he just passed away.
Yeah.
Yeah, a month or two ago.
Yeah, he lost his power after that collision, and that was, in my mind, uncalled for. It wasn't necessary. You can look at it every different way.
I even go as far back as to have, I pitched to Dale Crandall, and most people remember he was considered one of the greatest ever. But Gabe Paul bought Dale Crandall solely to catch me in my beginning years there in Cleveland.
You're on a team with a guy from my hometown, Paducah, Kentucky, Phil Roof. Do you remember him?
Oh, heavens, yeah. I just saw Phil Roof about, I'm going to say 6 months ago at a golf tournament down in Florida.
Randy Ringler wants to ask a question.
Yeah, hi. I'm assuming that when you were with Toronto, I don't know what years offhand, but I assume that Dr. Ron Taylor was there as well, and that could have been interesting with you both having second careers that brought you back into the game in a similar capacity in terms of dealing with players' medical issues, physical and mental.
Oh, yes. Ron Taylor was a great guy, is a great guy. He and I were teammates in Salt Lake City. And in fact, for a short period, we were roommates. And then he went on to Cleveland for 2 years. And then, as you know, got traded over to the Mets and had a fantastic career as a relief pitcher. He also had a degree before he ever came into baseball. He was an engineer. He had his degree in engineering. And then when he was finished with baseball, he wasn't sure what he was going to do. And one of the owners of the Toronto Blue Jays talked him into going back to school, medical school. And he became a medical doctor and became the team physician for Toronto up until just 3 or 4 years ago. And he still is part of the Toronto organization. Great guy.
Yeah, he actually almost had to get medicine for me from Canada. And he asked me, he says, Randy, please, if you can do it any other way, because otherwise I have to write a 50-page paper to prove why you need it in the United States from Canada.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, he is a great guy.
Okay, anybody else? One last chance here.
Yeah, I gotta go to bed before midnight. That's my curfew.
Well, Sam, I can't thank you enough. This has been just a blast. You are a treasure to the game of baseball, and there are a lot of people who, well, some who owe their lives to you, but just recovery, getting out of trouble, and it's you've been quite a leader in that area. I also think that you have, and thought so at the time, the coolest baseball cards going back in the 60s. You were a cool looking guy.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
And thanks so much, and hope you can make it to Cleveland. You will at some point in time, and I want to remind everybody, get this book. It is already a bestseller. You can pre-order it, and it's long overdue. I look forward to reading it.
Thank you very much. And Marty, keep checking your emails because I'm told that the flight may change again.
And,
Yes, I'm gonna be doing that right away.
and
Thanks,
thank-
Sam.
and thanks to all of our guests for other chapters for joining us today. We appreciate it so much.
Take care.
Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.